and welcome to our second episode of Studying Guide for the Noahide. My name is Abby, and in this video study is our newest project from Being Noahide. And before we get into our study, I'd like to introduce my on-screen co-hosts. We have Andrew Overall. Wave at the screen, Andrew. We have Jacob Sharp. Wave at the screen, Jacob. And so in this project, we're reading Guide for Noahide. The plan is to read paragraph by paragraph and then stop as we're studying and discuss and talk about halakha. And Andy and Andrew and Jacob are going to be the primary speakers with regard to that set of knowledge. If you don't have a copy of this book, you can get it on Amazon. Either order the hard print or Kindle, or you can also buy it at the publisher's website, lightcatcherbooks.com. And this is going to be an ongoing series of study. And what I would suggest to you, if you have this book, is to read along with us. And as we're talking and discussing, if you have a pad and note paper, take some notes, write down any questions. And then when we post this and you have those questions at the end of the episode, to just post them in the comment section. And I think you'll get a lot out of it too. So with that, we have on here, let's see here, everybody, you guys can see my screen with the book? Right?
Yes.
Here's the beautiful cover. So last week we read and studied in the author's preface the background and history section. We covered this entire section, and you're welcome to go look at that episode on our channel. And today we're going to actually continue reading. Sorry, I'm clicking too fast. We're going to start reading here where it says the need of the hour, teaching Rambam according to Rambam. So yeah, that's where we're at.
Yeah, and this week, as we go through this, you should keep in mind a couple of questions that a couple of points that we're going to be talking about. One of them is, what are all these different texts that make up the oral tradition, and how do they fit together? Second is, how do these texts relate to each other? And third is, I guess, in what way should we relate to these texts? So which texts should we hold most, authoritative, and which texts do we hold less authoritative, and why? And from which texts can we really learn our 7 laws? So keep those questions in mind as we go through the text tonight, because hopefully we'll cover all those points.
Yes. So in this episode, Andy's going to be our reader. And so let's get started. Take it away, Andy. Andrew. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Abby. All right. So now we begin on this section, in which we will learn the importance of learning laws, a halakha, that is based on Rambam's Mishneh Torah. So here we go. The need of the hour to teach Rambam according to Rambam. Milestone was reached in 2008 with the publication of the Divine Code by Rabbi Moshe Weiner, with the assistance of Rabbi Eliyahu Toger, English translator and commentator to the Moznaim Mishneh Torah series. Here was a first attempt to produce a comprehensive legal code, a veritable Shulchan Aruch, which was a more recent code of Jewish law written in the 16th century. This was for Noahides, based chiefly on Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah is the great encyclopedic code of practical law written by Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, of blessed memory, and this is greatly significant. Now, here, as Jacob mentioned, when we're learning about the texts, that relate to the oral law or contain all the laws that were part of the oral law. We come to one here, one of many, but we'll learn here what makes this particular text significant in learning our laws, in following the path of God, as well as how it relates to the Tanakh, this work, Mishnah Torah. Rambam, just briefly, was a rabbi, not just a rabbi, but one of the greatest rabbis, let's say in the past, really more than 1,000 years. He grew up and was raised in Spain, and like many colleagues of his time, had inherited the tradition of learning both Tanakh and oral law, going all the way back to Moshe at Sinai, as many rabbis do, and was counted as one of the greatest rabbis for his scholarly work, case in point with Mishnah Torah, among other things, as well as being known for a great physician, from whom, if I'm not mistaken, it was, forgive me, not the Hippocratic Oath, but certainly a philosophical approach to medical treatment and healing. But many other things about him, but just in brief, who was Rambam and Mishnah Torah. Jacob, anything to comment on?
There's a great ethical prayer, or I guess an ethical statement, a statement of ethics that's still widely used in the medical world today that he penned.
So I actually I just made a note for myself. There's a couple of things that that I had a question on. If you could just like briefly define what Mishnah Torah means, what the word or term Mishnah Torah means, and what the word or term Shulchan Aruch means.
Yeah, the words themselves. So Shulchan Aruch means a set table, and the idea is that the idea of the book, I guess, being that the halacha for a religious Jew is laid out before you like a set table, so that it's easy to approach.
This came after Mishnah Torah.
Yes, it was written. The Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century. The Mishnah Torah, which is another code of Jewish law, precedes that. It was written in the 1100s, roughly, in the Common Era, by the Rambam. And Mishnah Torah means, I guess, like the second, the repetition of the Torah, I guess you would say. And it also is a code of Jewish law containing all of Jewish halakha. Now, the difference between the two works, just really in brief, is that the Mishnah Torah, written by the Rambam, contains pretty much a summary of all of halakha, really, all of the practical do's and don'ts, and all of their particular details in very plainly stated text, so you can read through it and understand it, and it's laid out in a nicely well-organized way. But it includes everything that one can practice today, and things that one can't practice today, like how to build the temple and how to do the temple services, and things that Jews can't even do currently. The Shulchan Aruch is sort of a distillation of that. The idea was basically the Mishnah Torah may contain too many extraneous things that, it's kind of difficult for a person in the modern era, a modern era being the 1600s or 1700s, it's hard for them to wade through all this stuff that they can't do today. So they distilled it down to just the things that Jews can currently do, like putting on tefillin and saying the prayers, and it omits things like building the temple and making sacrifices. Generally.
So how would you say this kind of relates to the Noahide situation today? Like, why do you think Maury is bringing this illustration, these two to illustrate?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Abby?
Why do you think Maury is using these two works to kind of illustrate the need of the hour for Bnei Noach?
Oh, well, I think it's pretty easy to answer, because in our time, many of us who have come out of the church, or some who left secularism, or even people maybe raised in other religions, who are coming to discover the truth of Hashem as the God of Israel is also the God of all humanity. We come to find that there was a Torah that was bequeathed to Noah. It was only the nation of Israel that kept this intact. Not just the judgments, the halakha, the Torah for them, but also for us, the nations. While they remained intact, keeping their tradition, our ancestors had abandoned this a long time ago to idolatry. Now that we come out of all of that, we find, well, what are our laws? True, we see that there are 7 laws. It's nice it can fit on a business card. There's more to it than just these mnemonics. That's the reason that we have this book here, which really is like an introduction to learning our halachot vis-a-vis the Mishnah Torah, which in another discussion can explain, really as we move forward, understand why this work is significant. But why this book? As our Mori has diligently studied his own laws as a Jew, has also studied Noahide halacha, and seeing that it is really incumbent, as we learned in the previous chapter, for Israel to teach our obligations to us, in a way kind of reminding us, refreshing us. Now there's a need for writing this book to, you could say, introduce or perhaps reintroduce us to that ancient Torah. That's one way of putting it. And before we go to the next paragraph, as we'll understand as we go further here, that this is a part of oral law, or oral Torah. See that there's the Torah that you see in the 5 books of Moses, all right, and of course all of Tanakh. But along with that Torah, there were judgments or details of all of the commandments of Hashem, of God, that came along with them. And it was given in a culture in which they learned and taught these orally. And in our times, it may seem hard to believe that anyone would have the capacity for that, but that is the case when you don't have so many distractions as we do in our times. The human brain does have an amazing capacity to memorize a lot and to actually make connections between the halachot, okay, or all the details of the commandments, and the written law itself. I'm not going into detail. That is, in a way, explaining you could say what happens with Torah study, real Torah study, when making connections between the written Torah and the oral law. But we'll go on to this, reading the next paragraph, and I'm sure Jacob can explain that as we move on. Okay, so continuing on. In theory, God's entire law, including all the laws for non-Jews, can be completely learned, successfully practiced, and taught straight from the ancient written sources, Bible, and the sum total of Talmudic literature, which is the repository of the oral law, Mishnah, Tosefta, Mechilta, Sifra, Jerusalem Talmud, and Babylonian Talmud. Since the Jewish sages sealed the oral law from further redaction with the completion of the Babylonian Talmud, these sources represent the full court record, an unbroken tradition from Moses at Mount Sinai, by which we can know every detail of how the laws must be kept and how those details are received or derived by the sages from the written law, the Bible. There's a great deal in here to be explained. Jacob?
Yeah, so the general idea, so as we know, the Torah consists of 2 parts. There's the written Torah, which we're all familiar with. It's the 5 books of Moses. And then there's the oral Torah, which is the tradition when Moshe went up on Har Sinai and received the Torah from Hashem. He was up there for 40 days, and he wasn't simply given the text of the written Torah. It was explained to him how to do it, and every particular detail was explained to him. And there's an oral tradition as to how the meanings behind certain things and how certain concepts can be derived from it. And then on top of that, Hashem commanded Moshe to establish the Sanhedrin, right? The great court of 70 sages. And these, in every generation, as the Sanhedrin exists, they can basically make additional rulings. They can, and it's not like they're making up new rulings, but new situations will arise which no one has ever dealt with before. Like, oh no, what do we do with this new piece of technology? Can we use electricity on Shabbat? Things like that will arise, and they'll, using the rules of interpretation of the Torah that Moshe received from Hashem, they'll be able to derive new rulings that apply to these new situations and hand those down in an unbroken oral tradition. So this happened from the time of Moshe and all the way through Israel's history, as long as there was a Sanhedrin, and they made new rulings and they handed those down. And as this went on, there, at certain points in history, there became a need for them to actually write down or codify some of these concepts, so that they could be more easily taught to the next generation. And this is something that always happened. It's not like at some point they went, oh, we should write this down. That's a new idea. But rather, as these concepts were handed down, they would tend to hand them down in the form of like very short, memorable, like mnemonic statements, which we refer to as Mishnayot, or Mishnahs. And these statements, the sages, as they would learn from their teachers, they would write them in their own notebooks. But there came a point where, due to persecution by the Roman Empire and all this other stuff, this was around like was it in the mid-200s of the Common Era, when the sages basically determined, in order for us to be able to continue handing this down properly, and to make sure that the entirety of the oral tradition is handed across properly from generation to generation going forward, we need to make like a master notebook of information.
So when you say sages, you mean the members of the Sanhedrin, right? So not just a random group of people. These are
not just
people for the Sanhedrin.
these were not just random people going, hey, it's a good idea. No, it was the actual, like, the members of the Sanhedrin itself. And so they put together they compiled basically a master collection of notebooks, and this is what we refer to as the Mishnah. And from that point on, as time progressed and the need became more and more, they would put together additional works like Tosefta and Mechilta, and eventually the Mishnah, as you could say, evolved in a sense into the Jerusalem Talmud, and finally the Babylonian Talmud, at which point basically there stopped being a Sanhedrin after that, and the Babylonian Talmud is basically like the final codification of this information, handed down directly from the Great Court, the codification of the oral Torah. So at that point, that's what he's referring to here when he says at that point it was basically sealed, meaning there could be no more changes made to the Talmud itself. This is what it is.
How did they seal it? Or was it just a function of the court that you can never, without a court, you can't update the I guess the case law?
Yeah, essentially it's that latter. Only the Sanhedrin itself can actually make new rulings that are binding. And there hasn't been a Sanhedrin since, 1,600 years ago, roughly? So it's sealed in the sense that there simply can be no more rulings.
Until the next Sanhedrin.
Right. Until the Jewish people reestablish the Sanhedrin. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. And so, yeah, what he's saying here is that all of the oral Torah is basically contained in these works.
Which one
So
is the most authoritative? Like, do they compete against each other, the Tosefta and?
not really. They contain different pieces of information, basically. I guess you could say the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud compete in a sense, but they don't really. Ultimately, in the Torah world, the Babylonian Talmud is considered the final authority on halakha.
And it's important to explain this here without dwelling on detail too much, because you see, okay, why do you have two Talmuds? What's the competition? And the answer is, in two words, Roman persecution. The scholarship always remained in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, but the Roman Empire had come down upon what at that point was the Kingdom of Judea, and they had destroyed Jerusalem, had destroyed the temple, may it be restored speedily in our days, and as a result, the court had to go underground lest they all be killed. And you can imagine trying to conduct sessions when you're in hiding like that. Well, many of the great scholars from the land of Israel had to migrate east, beyond the reaches of the Roman Empire, where they could continue their scholarship in safety and in peace, which happened to be along the Euphrates, what is now modern-day Iraq. And as time went on, the persecution from the Roman government became harder and harder, and it's just difficult for the scholars in Israel to do what they have always done as efficiently as they would like to, as they prayed for. While at the same time, the scholars and the Jewish scholars in Babel and Babylon, their learning continued to flourish. And make no mistake, the sages in Babylon, they traced their lineage back to the scholars in Israel, which at that time it was not too far off in terms of time. All right? And of course, that could be another discussion in itself on the details, how and why and so forth. Actually,
also, there is another important piece to this, which is that there is a 200-year span between the writing of the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. So the Jerusalem Talmud was written at a certain point in time when there was still a Sanhedrin, and then there was roughly 200 years of additional legislation, and then the Babylonian Talmud was written. So there's, rulings can be overturned potentially, and there was 200 years of additional Sanhedrin legislation between those times that the Babylonian Talmud encapsulates, that the Jerusalem Talmud doesn't.
Essentially, what you see in this one paragraph here, again, is the result of Roman persecution and the courageous and the blessed attempts of the scholars of Israel to retain Torah learning when they're almost practically in hiding and all the communities are scattered. I mean, it's a miracle when you really learn how they're able to accomplish this, and communities were able to retain their faithfulness to the covenant and so forth. And Baruch Hashem, thank God, the Torah is still with them, and so now we come to learn from them, be refreshed on our own lives.
I think too the relevant thing to keep in mind here is that this is where even Noahide halakha is originated from. And Maury has another book, Rabbi Baron, we call him Maury, has another book called Oral Torah from Sinai, and he spends a lot of time in that book talking about how the oral law came about. I think he spends a lot of time explaining this history and how it came about, how it became written down, and how it's used in Jewish law for daily life. And I think that's if you're interested in learning more in depth about the oral law and how it works, I recommend getting that book and reading it.
Yes.
But I think for the purpose of this book, I think continuing to read might help explain why all this is relevant to us.
So, continuing on here, he writes, practically, however, this is very complicated. Many years of intensive study are required to master this vast sea of literature. The final and most authoritative layer of this legal tradition, before it was sealed against later reform, is the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli. It will henceforth be referred to here as Talmud. It was written in a difficult dialect of Aramaic mixed with other languages. Furthermore, in our times, we no longer have texts of the Talmud that are uncensored and fully accurate. We no longer have the tradition required to identify non-authoritative conclusions added into the Talmud, despite the fact that it was to remain sealed by post-Talmudic sages. We no longer have the ability to accurately distinguish between the authentic traditions received by the Geonim, though not included in the Talmud, and their non-authoritative conclusions. Now, what's an idea or an important thing to take away from this particular paragraph, what the Mori is presenting here? He's talking about the difficulty of learning Babylonian Talmud, any of the rabbinic literature, in light of further problems that have exacerbated scholarship in the exile. But don't take this as saying that absolutely nothing can be learned in the Talmud. He's not saying that it's so completely lost that there's nothing to be learned from it. If I can explain that when the Talmud's written down, they're still learning this according to principles of oral tradition. And as time went on, as Rambam would explain in his introduction to Mishneh Torah, by his time, which had been roughly about 600 years after the Babylonian Talmud was sealed, even he explained the problems plaguing all Jewish communities in understanding clearly the laws. Not necessarily the fundamentals. The Jews agreed upon this, the foundations of the faith, of the covenant, knowing Hashem. But to keeping all the fine details of all their 630 mitzvot, it had become difficult to learn in the traditional way it had, right? But as we'll learn, as being such a great scholar of Talmud and all rabbinic literature, he took it upon himself to put this together in a simpler format, resembling the style, the simpler style of the Mishnah. Anything you want to comment on, Jacob?
Or as the Rambam says, he basically said, you know, the average person, the average Jew, who needs to know the halakha so that he can actually do it on a day-to-day basis, doesn't necessarily have the time and, in many cases, even the inclination to be able to sit down and master the Talmud. So the Rambam put together the final rulings from the Talmud in a very easy, logically laid out way so that your average Joe could pick it up, say, oh, wait, how am I supposed to do this? Open it up to the right section, read through it, and understand. Because it's not supposed to be difficult to understand. It's supposed to be very straightforward and laid out before you.
Would you say a fair analogy would be like, not everybody today has the time to go study all the state statutes. I mean, they're very extensive. You don't have time to become a lawyer for state statutes. So you might just order a book and, you know, what is the law in buying, one of those like little pamphlet books about buying a car or being a renter, and that's how you get your information. It's like a distillation of the law.
Right. And here's the thing, a lot of people, a lot of non-Jews who come to this probably don't realize from the Talmud. Because you can crack open the Talmud and start reading like a translation of it, and it's like, oh, this doesn't seem all that hard. But here's the thing. You can crack open the Talmud to any random page and begin reading, and everything you read could be wrong or not true. The Talmud isn't a book of statements that, like, these are all true statements that are being made. The Talmud is a very complicated book, and it contains... So just to give you an idea of the complex nature of the Talmud. So the Talmud is sort of a book that grew over, you know, the process, I guess, of like, you know, 1,000 or 300 or 400 years. And actually even beyond that, it's continued to grow for like thousands of years. But it started off with the Mishnayot, which are essentially like very, very short, pithy phrases. They're not meant to be picked up and read and understood. They're very dense. You're supposed to read them be taught by a teacher a whole bunch of information as to like what this actually means. And then this short phrase is like a mnemonic to remind you of that information. If you weren't taught the information, you won't necessarily be able to get that from the Mishnah. In fact, you may misunderstand the basic teaching from what the Mishnah says if you weren't taught that. So then the Talmud comes along, and so it'll record several Mishnayot, and then it'll jump into what's called Gemara, right? So this is essentially a commentary on the Mishnayot that was written before, nowadays when we have commentary on a text, like this. Yeah, here's a good example. So we have, we have some text here, and then there's commentary down on the bottom, right? So text, commentary, that's sort of a standard format, right? Well, the Gemara was written before that was like a textual standard. So you have like Mishnah, 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 Gemara, 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 Mishnah, 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 Gemara, Gemara, and they're just sort of interspersed. You have to know where they cut off and cut in. Now, these commentaries, sometimes they'll actually provide additional Mishnayot that later Sanhedrins said. Sometimes they'll provide Rabbi so-and-so taught this. And then they discuss it for a long time. But it turns out Rabbi so-and-so was just wrong. And everyone disagrees with him. But the text doesn't necessarily tell you that. You have to know that this is wrong.
Oh, you have to be taught.
It. Right. Because you were taught this is, Rabbi so-and-so was wrong on this point, and we know this. And they record it because, this is an idea that may come up periodically, so let's record it here so that we know, we already discussed this. It's wrong. And it's filled with things like this, that these books are not like Roman books that we're used to. The way Western books are written, you can just pick them up and begin reading, and everything you need to understand it is right there. This is not that sort of textual tradition. These books were intended to be basically notebooks that you refer to while being taught something orally. They weren't intended to be just picked up and read.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So first, who are the Geonim, and what does he mean by the authentic traditions received by the Geonim, though not included in the Talmud, and their non-authoritative conclusions? What exactly does that mean?
So the Geonim, there are a number of stages, I guess you would say, of the oral tradition. You're probably familiar with some of these, but you don't even realize it. So there's the time period in which the Torah was given, right? Then there's the era of the prophets, right? When the books of the prophets, we have the Tanakh, right? So there's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim are not necessarily, the Nevi'im being the books of the prophets, and the Ketuvim being the writings. These are not necessarily split up based upon like, oh, well, these are just writings, and these are all prophetic people. But rather they're split up based upon the time period in which the books were received, or in which the books were written. So there's the era of the prophets, and all of the books written in that time period are contained in the Nevi'im. Then there's the era of the writings, or the...
that includes Psalms and stuff, though.
Yep.
Could I jump in?
Please.
Yes. When talking about the Geonim and talking about these different stages, again, keeping in mind these different eras of scholarship refer to times when Jewish scholarship had to adapt. Now, don't mistake this with reform, that we're going to just completely overturn this law and overturn that law, and oh, hey, the Torah is written by men. No, not like that. But again, remember, like the Mishnah came about. Why? Because Roman persecution was making it more difficult. So again, you have these different eras, just like these writings, these works, different eras of scholarship where they're trying to adapt. And it goes like this. From the time the Torah was given to Moshe and on down until the Babylonian exile, all right, prophesied in the time, or really occurred in the time of Jeremiah, give a time scale, the court was completely intact. Not that it really wasn't intact later, but after the Babylonian exile, you have Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly in Babylon. This is the first time when Jewish scholarship was challenged. You know, could we survive outside the land? Baruch Hashem, they did. And much of what we know to be a Torah as practiced today, like in the case of the Siddur, with Jewish prayers, were decreed by them. And that court, his court, actually included some of the great prophets like Zechariah and Haggai, among others.
And that started the era of the Tanaim, they're called.
Actually, not long after the period of the Zugot, or pairs. Why? Because at that time, the pairs, where you had two leaders in each generation, because scholarship did suffer a little because of the persecution of the Greek Empire, until it became unified again, and which came to the era of the Tanaim, as Jacob pointed out. And in their time, the Zugot, the pairs.
I didn't know that was an explicit era.
Sorry?
I said I didn't know that was an explicit era. I thought they were all considered Tanaim.
Yes, but as it is, the Tanaim, they flourished until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the one who brought together the Mishnah. That era came to an end because of Roman persecution. It was too severe for scholarship to truly flourish. The next era, which began around about roughly 200, where scholarship is now in flourishing in Babylon, it continues on. It's an unbroken chain, but it's an attempt to survive. The era of the Amoraim, or explainers. Why? Because they're trying to clarify these traditions that they're learning so that they're not lost. All right? And that's where you also get the Talmud coming. After the Amoraim, you have the Savoraim, which is an era around the time where the Talmud, it's still being redacted, but it comes to a close. It was roughly in the 5th century.
Now these are all members. All these the Geonim, the Tanaim, the Amorim. These are all members of the Sanhedrin, right? This is just not the name of a generation. What is it?
Okay.
What are these titles?
Okay. The Sanhedrin. Okay. Having Mosaic ordination to pass judgment, to enact decrees, that came to an end. Again in the 5th century, again thanks to the Roman Empire largely, when at that point Smicha, Mosaic ordination, had come to an end. So that means that the rabbis will be very, very limited into how they could, again, really decree or legislate. They would still be leaders and would be teachers, passing on the oral tradition. But after that time, as Jacob mentioned, this occurred about 1,600 years ago. Okay, from that time, you have the era of the Gaonim. Gaon is means like pride or genius. And again, it's not as if they go into this era and then one day they realize, hey, we're no longer the Tanaim, we're the Amoraim. And the next era, hey, we're Gaonim. No, it's more like they look back on history and they realize where these changes had occurred. Why? In exile, this is what happens. How do you adapt to these things that keep occurring? Imagine okay, in the era of technology, with computer upgrades, you have version 1, version 1.2, version 2, and so on and so forth. That's one way of looking at it when talking about these different eras of Jewish scholarship. That's one thing. But there's more to explain, Jacob?
Yeah, I think that basically covers it. It's there's certain eras of the sages basically that we group them up into, going back into the past, and I guess the Geonim were the last ones that had a really
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
Really dense. Didn't expect this, did you, boys and girls?
so it seems to me up until this point that we've read that it seems like there's been a lot of effort and work and heartache and pain put in by generations of the Jewish people just to preserve knowledge. Whereas, I mean, for Noahide Halakha, there is nothing similar for it outside of the Torah tradition.
Right. Well, here's the beauty. They've retained the knowledge of the Shiva Mitzvot. It's not like the knowledge of our laws were lost. This is part of the knowledge that they've retained within their oral tradition,
right?
And within the the written Torah and everything as well. So it's there for us. And what Mori is pointing out in this book is that in these last couple paragraphs here, which we're discussing a lot, but they're very important, is that while theoretically it's possible that a person could pick up these original sources like the Talmud and so forth and actually go through that and learn, the details of the 7 laws, from a practical perspective, yeah, good luck, buddy. It's kind of not going to happen for a number of reasons, not least of which is you don't have the chops to do it. There's too much deep knowledge that you have to have. You have to be taught it by someone. You have to have a command of Hebrew, and not just Hebrew. You have to have a command of like Aramaic, and you have to have a command of like several different ancient dialects of Aramaic, and not just those. You have to know the difference between like, so if so and so uses this word, in the 300s, that was slang at the time in Babylon for this. But if this other guy uses that same phrase, 300 years later in France, well, that's not the same thing at all. And you have to like understand the difference between like slang used in different eras, basically, in odd dialects of things. It's all very complicated.
Okay. So.
Shall I continue?
Okay. So, going on our last paragraph here for our reading, before our time comes to a close. So, it continues. Mishnah Torah is the most accurate and the only fully encyclopedic code of Torah law ever written, besides the much later and less authoritative Aruch HaShulchan. Written 850 years ago, it was written from an earlier and clearer vantage point than subsequent codes of law shortly after the close of the era of the Geonim. That is, the rabbinical sages of the era from after the sealing of the Talmud until the 11th century. Most importantly, the author was a highly critical researcher, not content even with the commonly relied upon Talmudic literature and traditions even in those times, and the inaccurate legal opinions based on them. Rambam, one of the greatest masters of Talmud ever, sought out the most reliable manuscripts and consulted the Torah sages in the land of Israel in his day. For example, he corrected a common mistake from the rabbis of the Gaonic era based on his discovery of a portion of a retired Talmud written on animal skin some 500 years old in his day, which can be found in the Mishnah Torah in the Book of Judgments, the Laws of Claimants and Respondents. Now,
can I suggest that you read on one more paragraph and then stop and discuss?
So, okay, very good.
Yeah, I think that would finish that whole thought.
Okay, very good. Okay. In this aggressive pursuit of truth, Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah in order to codify and thereby preserve the most accurate understanding of law possible, an understanding that can only be achieved by mastering the entire corpus of the primary sources of the oral law from the most reliable sources that existed in his time. He wrote it in simple, clear Hebrew, making it far easier to master than the ocean of difficult, terse Hebrew and archaic Aramaic. in order to put the entire breadth of Torah law even in the hands of laymen, women, and children, not only advanced Torah scholars. For these reasons and more, the best way to learn, practice, and teach pure Talmudic law in our times is straight from the Mishneh Torah. Now, also to be clear, this is not to make out to say that, how would you say, that there's any kind of presumption on the part of Rambam, but again, as someone, Jews are known for being very precise about many things, no less in being with law, okay, and this with knowing what is true, what is accurate, what is right and wrong. You could say that Rambam was one among them, above them, or let's say beyond them, going beyond that, let me put it that way, in trying to be precise with the law. And we'll learn as we go on the importance of precision in the law, and why we want to be very careful with it, lest we make a mistake which can easily snowball, and then, how would you say, things can become tangled, and then we may, God forbid, forget or have a misunderstanding in God's law. But let's see. That, yes, that was his purpose in putting together Mishneh Torah. So even in his day, right, for all the scholarship that exists even in our times, many great Torah teachers and Torah scholars who pore over volumes of this. Anyone who's ever heard of the Daf Yomi or Page a Day study, even for modern Jews, with all the conveniences of the modern world, it can be difficult just to get through a page a day. Here was a scholar who achieved the entire vast sea of rabbinic literature, and again, from where he stood in his times, himself having inherited the proper traditions of understanding this. But I will stop myself.
It's not for nothing that they said of the Rambam, from Moshe to Moshe, there was none like Moshe. Meaning that he was like this level of like Torah genius that stood out in the Jewish world.
I think it might be kind of cool to point out how extensive the Mishneh Torah is, as extensive and breathtaking as the Talmud is. I know, Jacob, on your shelf you have all the volumes of the Mishneh Torah in translation, in English translation, and that's like what, 14 books?
Yeah, there's 14 total volumes in the Mishneh Torah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, what he put together was not a simple book like this necessarily.
Mm-hmm. It's very comprehensive, and going through the entire array of Jewish law. But here's the important thing. It doesn't just contain the entire array of Jewish halacha, and this is why it's so important for us to understand this, is that he also codified the Noahide laws in the Mishneh Torah. That's how comprehensive it is. And that's why it's important for us to understand the Mishneh Torah. Now, let me share with you a personal anecdote about this whole concept. So, I've been a Noahide for, I guess, since the early 90s, basically. So more than 20 years at this point. About 10 years into my journey, I came to a point where, well, let me back up. When I first started down the path of Torah, very early on, I decided I wanted to convert. And I started going down that path. And I stopped at a certain point when I realized I didn't know. I knew what I was going to be changing into if I continued along that path, into a Jew, but I didn't know what it meant to be what I currently am. I didn't know what it meant to be a non-Jew and follow God. So I decided to go down that path. And in the process of that, I then basically lived with and in an Orthodox Jewish community for probably about, the better part of 10 years after that. 7 or 8 years anyways. And I learned a lot of Torah, and I really was immersed in Jewish culture and Torah learning. And so at about 10 years into my journey, roughly.
Your conversion journey or your Noahide journey?
of my Noahide journey.
Oh.
I came to a point where I had enough Torah knowledge to realize that there were a lot of really giant gaping holes in my knowledge of how to actually do the 7 laws of Noah. Like, I knew you can't eat limb of a living creature, but I also knew that there were principles like, if you cook something in a pot, that pot can potentially, I knew a lot of the laws of kashrut for Jews. And I started to look at these two and apply them and go, well, wait, does this apply to the 7 laws as well? Like, if I go down to the grocery store and I pick up a can of green beans, can I eat these? Because it's likely they were processed on the same equipment that Eivar min hahai, or limb of a living creature, was processed. So almost certainly they are, corrupted with Eivar min hahai bits. So does that make this unkosher? And I suddenly found myself in a place where I was like, I literally don't think I can eat anything except fresh vegetables.
Turns out the beans are fine, right?
Yeah, it turns out, if you actually know the Torah halacha about this properly, the green beans are fine. There's no problem with it. But at the time, I didn't know. And I came to a new level of knowledge and was like, oh man, this is horrible. And I realized how little I actually knew about the 7 laws. And it was kind of horrifying. And faced with that, I realized that this was not an acceptable situation to continue living in. So basically, in a nutshell, I saved up my money, I sold everything I had, and I went on a flight to Israel. And I went and I began just knocking on the doors of yeshivas, saying, hello, I'm here to learn the 7 laws of Noah, and to learn all the details so that I can be precise in my observance of the halacha. And
This is in the early 2000s or late 90s?
Yeah, it was the early to mid 2000s, I guess, roughly.
Okay.
The exact year. Andrew is very good with remembering years. I tend not to be.
Well, yes, you traveled to Israel in 2003.
Okay, yeah, that sounds.
And eventually, that's how we met up with Rabbi Baron.
Yeah.
But even before then.
Well, I'm getting to that part. So,
sorry.
So I began just knocking on the doors of yeshiva and going, I want to learn all the details of the 7 laws, and I'm willing to sit here and learn so that I can be precise in their observance, as I'm required to be according to the Mishnah Torah. And pretty much one and all, well, first of all, they turned me away. They were like, I'm sorry, we don't have permission, Noahide, get out of here. But I managed to get audiences with a lot of big rabbis, people who were big in the Noahide world, essentially the leading scholars of the Sheva Mitzvah. And I sat down with them and I was like, please teach me, tell me how I can learn, tell me where I can go to learn. And one and all, without exception, they all told me the same thing. And these were rabbis, these weren't all, Temani or Yemenite rabbis. These were Ashkenazim and Haredim and Sephardic rabbis and very mystical-minded people and very rational-minded people and people from the entire spectrum of the Jewish world. And one and all, they told me the same 2 things. They said, one, we'd love to teach you, but we can't because we don't know the details of the 7 laws well enough to really teach you to the degree you're asking. And 2, if you want to learn all the details, what you need to do is study the Mishnah Torah, because that's the place where they are laid out. And they all told me this. So at that point, I essentially then, through a friend of a friend, met up with Rabbi Baron and his teacher, and they were basically people who studied the Mishnah Torah very intensely. So, everyone was telling me, learn this from the Mishnah Torah. That's where the details of the Sheva Mitzvot are found. So I went and I began studying with them, and then, we've been doing that for the past 11, 12 years now, very intensively and the very directed, focused purpose. And so yeah, that's why. Really, if we as Noahides really want to learn our halachot, the Mishnah Torah is where we need to learn them from.
this book will help guide us through that.
And one more thing, I just want to get this in there. I know we're over time, but there's two very important things. As we go through reading through Guide for the Noahide, and as we're learning that this is based on Mishnah Torah, and it's an introduction to studying Halacha through those means, that when studying Halacha, it is always helpful to have what is called a chavrutha. Chavrutha comes from the word chaver, meaning friend or companion. So tradition in Jewish scholarship of two who study together. One reads, and then they go back and forth and they comment, and the other reads, they go back and forth and they comment. They might have questions and answers. They may even debate for the sake of heaven, or there may be nothing and they just move on and they may think of something later. But as the saying goes, iron sharpens iron. Something that Jacob and I have been blessed to practice now for roughly about, I guess, going on to 16 years or so. Baruch Hashem. And hopefully, people who watch our videos here and go through this will feel encouraged to find other Noahides to team up with and to start Chavrutha studies of their own, just simply getting together, if maybe in the same place, or as we find we're all over the world, over Skype or GoToMeeting or WebEx or Google Hangouts, and doing this very thing. This is largely what we're doing. Our experience in the Chavrutha, trying to bring out to the world here. And the final word here, and then I'll shut up, and that is, when learning Torah, always consult with a good Rav, or acquire for yourself a Rav.
Teacher.
Don't ever think that even though, as Rambam intended to place the halacha in the hands of all the people, and it's always really been the case from the beginning, from the times of Moshe, that you always have someone who is wiser than yourself. And I'm sure there are many who could stand way above me, okay? And but that is the thing. But that is the two things: acquire a companion, the Torah companion, Hashem help you, and a good Rav who is knowledgeable in Noahide Halacha.
I will say from personal experience, I am actually blessed to live within the vicinity of Andrew and Jacob. And there's nothing like coming up with a question in your head and wondering, and you just ask one of these guys or both of them. Usually if they're both sitting there, it's great because then they'll go back and forth. And it's been a blessing in my life because I know before I met them, I had to like go on the internet and do some searches and ask on forums, which I still kind of do, but not as much before because now I can just go to these two who have been taught by Mor Michal. And it's actually a lot easier and a lot more fun and a lot more interesting because then I could ask follow-up questions right away. It's actually kind of cool. So if you guys don't have anything else to add, I think we can stop here until next time. And
thank you everyone for your patience with us. I know we went over time.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's just a few minutes. I don't think we're not like on a hard time crunch with YouTube, so.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody who's watched our video. We hope you enjoyed our little study session here. If you have any questions or comments about anything in the video, hope you've been taking notes and writing down your questions, please post them in the comments in the forums, and we'll be checking to, we'll try and answer them in the forums. If it's a really good question, we may actually do a comment video and just deal with it by itself on video. So do post your questions, your comments, and we'll see you offline.
Yes. So, Leila Tov and Shavua Tov. Good night and good week, everyone. And God be with you. All your endeavors bring you success.
Amen.